Hello, my name is Brennan Snyder, and I will be doing my macro indicators project on Iceland. So this slide's about Iceland. Iceland is an island country located in the North Atlantic Ocean. It is a land of vivid contrast of climate, geography, and culture. Sparkling glaciers lie across its ruggedly beautiful mountain ranges. Abundant hot geysers provide heat for many of the country's homes and buildings and allow for hothouse agriculture year-round. And the offshore Gulf Stream provides a surprisingly mild climate for what is one of the northernmost inhabited places on the planet. Iceland was founded more than 1,000 years ago during the Viking Age of exploration and settled by a mixed Norse and Celtic population. Iceland is a Scandinavian country, the world's oldest democracy, but modern in nearly every aspect. Unlike most European countries, however, it is ethnically homogeneous, so much so that genetic researchers have used its inhabitants to study hereditary disorders and develop cures for a host of diseases. Iceland's population is currently 383,100 people. So this is the GDP percent growth rate graph for the past 6 years for them. They didn't have any 2024, so I did 2018 to 2023. Here's a graph analysis for the GDP rate. The GDP rate started off good in 2018. It was at a growth of 4.9%. In 2019, though, however, the growth rate dropped down to 1.9%. Then in 2020, when COVID hit, the GDP dropped down to negative 6.9%, basically plummeting. It then made a great bounce back to 5.3% in 2021. It continued to rise even higher in 2022 by rising to 9%. And now in 2023, it is at 5% growth. These past 6 years have showed that the economy has had a giant dip, but it's also bounced back significantly. Right now, they are growing at a great percentage and look to keep on going up near the future. Here's the annual inflation rate for them, their percentage. Here's an analysis for it. The annual inflation rate started off very well in 2018 with an increase by 2.7%. It then followed well in 2019 and 2020, increasing by only 3% and 2.8%. Then in 2021, it started to take a bigger swing. It jumped to 4.4%. This wasn't a really big jump, but it was much higher than the previous years. The next 2 years would turn out to be the highest jumps of this period. In 2022, the inflation rate took a huge jump to 8.3%. This was the highest jump since 2009. That was when the largest protests in Iceland occurred. In 2023, it also increased by a lot, having a jump to 8.7%. Here's the annual unemployment percentage in Iceland. The annual unemployment rate has slowly gone up throughout the past 6 years and has swung a lot. In 2018, the rate was at 2.7%, which is very low. In 2019, it swung up a bit, increasing to 3.5%. Then in 2020, it increased a decent bit to 5.5%, still not being very high. In 2021, it went to 6%. Then in 2022 and 2023, it decreased to 3.8% and 3.5%. All these numbers are still very good. The only number being a bit high is the 6%. However, this is still a very good number to be at. Here's a case study for all of the numbers. In my case study, I wanted to be looking at the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic had significant impact across all the country. The pandemic started around March 2020 and ended in around May 2023. This event made the GDP growth percentage drop significantly in 2020. It went from 1.9% to negative 6.9%, a drop of 8.8%. The GDP slowly rose after that drop, but the drop was was very significant. And the inflation during this pandemic raised a little bit, but not much. It changed the most in 2022 when it went from 4.4% the previous year to 8.3% in 2022. It slowly increased during these years, but nothing significant compared to the GDP. The unemployment rate did rise some during the pandemic, but compared to the other countries like the US, it didn't raise by much. The highest it rose was 6% in 2021, but in 2022, it was back down to 3.8%. The most influenced thing during this time was the GDP percentage. The other two were still affected by the pandemic, but not as much as the GDP. Long-term wise, the numbers are mostly going back down to what they were to begin with, and more so mellowing out. However, these numbers are still steadily increasing over the years. Here's my indicator relationship questions. How does an increase in GDP typically affect the unemployment rate? Typically, as GDP increases, it has a positive effect on the unemployment rate. This means that the unemployment rate would go down. What happens to consumer spending when inflation rises significantly? When inflation increases significantly, consumer spending typically decreases. How might a decrease in unemployment influence inflation rates? A decrease in unemployment typically leads to an increase in inflation rates. Can a high GDP growth rate lead to higher inflation? Explain why or why not. It typically would lead to a higher inflation rate. This is because as an economy grows quickly, consumers are getting more money. This means that the demand for goods goes up faster than the supply of goods can go up. How does a recession usually impact unemployment and inflation? During a recession, typically what happens is unemployment rates go up while inflation rates go down or increase. How do changes in interest rates by central banks affect GDP and inflation? Lowering rates may boost GDP but would potentially raise inflation. However, raising rates would slow down GDP growth and slow down inflation. What role does government spending play in influencing GDP and unemployment? Increasing government spending can still stimulate demand, boost output, and reduce unemployment, therefore increasing GDP. Decreased government spending has the opposite effect. How might changes in productivity affect GDP and unemployment? More productivity would increase GDP and lower unemployment, whereas lower productivity would lead to an increase in GDP and higher unemployment. What is the relationship between GDP per capita and standard of living? A higher GDP capita typically means that there's going to be a higher standard of living. How does inflation affect the purchasing power of consumers and businesses? Inflation typically reduces the purchasing of consumers and businesses. This is because the cost of things is higher. In conclusion, Iceland seems like a very good economy for how small they are. Their unemployment rate isn't super high. The inflation rate is steadily increasing, as most countries are, but it isn't rapidly increasing, and the GDP rate is growing at a good percentage. I'm curious to see how their economy performs in the future, as it looks pretty good right now. This is a cool experience to get a look at other countries' numbers and see how they're growing. And here's my appendix.